Talking now about the ways of speaking empathically. How would one identify empathic speech? Or putting it from another perspective, how would one talk in order to put oneself in the mind of the other? How would one talk in order to share the other's experience? And the first part of my answer to that was describing certain exclamatory forms, certain noises, which are empathic in intent. And this is in fact, self-evident, isn't it? That you know that when you're with someone with whom you feel close, as we say, someone with whom you feel close, certain kinds of sympathetic, as we say, noises, expressions come spontaneously to you. In fact, you may not even need to say anything, as you may share the person's feeling on your face, or by what gestures you make, other means by which you indicate very briefly but cogently your presence in the person's experience, is another way we put that. And exclamations are significant in this, of course, because they are exclamatory. And that's significant because an exclamation is an expression of emotion, isn't it? And if you're going to share an emotion, you have to share it. You have to share in the expressing of it. And so the exclamation offers itself naturally as a form of empathic speech. How you say how awful, how terrible, or whatever it is that your emotion or emotions that you're proposing to be with. And one can describe all kinds of variations on accented exclamations, etc., by which one indicates that your perception of the person's emotional state. So that's one, perhaps the simplest form of empathic speech, certainly the most spontaneous. Indeed, that's one test of your empathy, that is the extent to which you are close enough to register those spontaneous utterances within yourself, whether you express them openly or not. And you can, for example, if you're sitting with someone and not only do you feel nothing, but you find nothing rising spontaneously to utter, then either you're not being empathic with that particular person, or that person is themselves flat or out to lunch in some other way, so there's nothing there for you to reach or contact. Now the second group of empathic statements are what I call imitative statements. And these also are still relatively simple empathic remarks, imitative statements. Now here you come upon perhaps the most sensitive acid test of empathy, the one by which you can perhaps most precisely determine the degree of your presence or the degree of your closeness to another person, in my opinion. And that is that those expressions which you can come up with, which complete the other person's thoughts. That is, we've talked about motor empathy, which is the way in which one imitates the movements of another person. We've talked about affective empathy and the sharing of feelings. And here is a cognitive empathy, in that you are then able, in your closness, to complete the sentences to yourself, that is, to complete the sentences that the other person's thoughts. This is called mind reading, and it's something that you often can observe in older people who live together for very long periods of time, who both out of habit and closeness speak in half sentences because they know what the rest of the thing is the other person thinking. If people in love often will talk in this way. So the communication is to an outsider very cryptic because you know what the other person is thinking. You can find yourself with certain patients able to do that too. And I think you'll be surprised if you haven't experienced it already, how accurate you can be in finishing someone's sentence. And notice that this provides you with what I like to call the most objective tool in all psychiatry. I emphasize that because empathic accidents are often seen as very subjective. But in fact, you have here a ubiquitously present instrument for determining your presence or absence in the other person's world. Just try to complete a sentence that they're making and see how close you can get. And you can really read the answer off the dial of your own cognition, your own mental work. And obviously you'll very seldom be absolutely accurate, except in someone whose speech forms you're very familiar with. But you can be astonishingly accurate in completing the sense of what a person is saying. This is also partly possible because there aren't very many things we think. I mean, we like to think they're very mysterious and special, but there really aren't very many things we think. And so that the exercise on a day-to-day basis isn't as remarkable as it might seem. Now, imitative statements is the name I give to those expressions which come to your mind, which express what the person is saying or feeling or thinking. So they simply constitute the thoughts of the other as expressed by you. And obviously they use the pronouns that the other person uses. How can I stand it? You might say to somebody who is having trouble standing it. That might be an imitative statement of their state of mind. Another word for this is doubling. It's an expression that's used in psychodrama. When you ask someone in psychodrama to act the part of another person. Doubling is also an expression that's used in child work to make contact with difficult children by trying to express for them what you think they're thinking. That's essentially imitative statements. Now, obviously there are as many imitative statements as there are thoughts anybody has, right? So there's no possible way by which you could classify them, since they encompass potentially every thought anybody could ever have. However, there are different purposes for which imitative statements are useful, and different kinds of imitative statements are useful for different purposes. And I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this, although it's an interesting thing to try to work out how to use imitative statements to get to different kinds of difficult people, for example. I thought, take it just as an example, a person who is very difficult to reach because their self-possession is very tenuously held. And this gets us to the notion of what self-possession is, which is a difficult matter to discuss. But we instinctively have some sense of what's meant by self-possession, as you possess yourself. It's a difficult idea for a lot of reasons, because the self possesses itself, so there's a kind of a double meaning of the word self in that sort of expression. And yet we know very well what it means, or we know what it feels like to lack self-possession. Now, the particular people in whom one class of imitative statements are useful, what I call bland imitative statements, are people who are very difficult to approach because their self-possession has been, maybe from earlier in their life, very heavily eroded. So that they've had, it seems to me that people like this have had to sort of retreat further and further into themselves to get away from the intrusive others that have surrounded them. And I like to think of them as like defeated people that have had to retreat into mountain country or something, to keep away from the constant intrusion on their self-possession that some parental figures, for example, are expert at. And so when you try to reach someone like that, you realize that they are out of sight. Not because they're crazy, they may be crazy, but sometimes because they have been unable to put themselves forward, as we say. They have been very hesitant to put themselves forward, perhaps because that's been too painful an experience. And so the value of bland imitative statements is that they announce our presence to the other person without seeming threatening. For example, if one is very clever at guessing what someone is thinking, that can be very frightening to someone whose self-possession is tenuous. And so these are statements which are bland or commonplace or really fundamentally rather obvious and uninteresting, but because of that very quality of the imitative statements, they're less likely to threaten people who are sensitive to an empathic invasiveness. Now, I hope I don't sound too cocky about something like this, because whenever you suppose that someone is deeply retreating from you, that they are out of sight, so to speak, in terms of their psychological presence, you're tempted to imagine that this is a sort of intrinsic state with them, that they are just defensive people, as we say. But we never know decisively that that's the case, do we? Because in fact, the reason they may be defensive is that we are offensive. And that the nature of psychological work is such that is always uncertain. That whether indeed their apparent defensiveness is a function of something characteristic, as we say of them, or characterological of them, or whether it's a function of some aspect of our own personalities of which we're perhaps unaware that is inadvertently offensive. Now, I wanted to read you a little passage from a description of a young woman that I saw, and how I tried to approach her as an illustration of a place where I thought that these imitative statements, I'll give some examples of it too, where these imitative statements I thought were useful. This was a 19-year-old woman who entered treatment because of anxiety and purposelessness. And she barely attended her college classes and smoked a great deal of pot and essentially did what her crowd did. And she was a rich girl, and she dressed very well, and she preened herself very carefully, but it was obvious that she had no joy in showing off her considerable good looks. And although she was not crazy in any sense that is generally used, she was remarkably absent-minded. And I think that's in the vernacular. She often looked like she was out to lunch. And we don't, when we use that expression, we don't necessarily mean that someone's crazy, but they're distracted or absent-minded, not flaky. Because when we say someone is flaky, we imply there's an element of craziness in it, while absent-mindedness or out to lunch suggests something more benign or distracted. And that was certainly true of her. However, when her mind was present, when she appeared to have presence of mind, as we say, the striking thing, it seemed to me, about her was that mind did what was asked of her. She didn't have automatic obedience in the sense that we sometimes discuss it here, but she was nevertheless very quick to do what she wanted. And she would find herself sometimes you would find yourself embarrassed by, sometimes almost inadvertently hinting at something and finding that she was rushing to do it. There was this, but when her mind was present, it was plastic in its relationship to the observer. Now, she described her father as a wealthy businessman and her mother as an alcoholic. And from as far back as she could remember, she recalled each of them complaining to her about the other. And in the last few years, this had grown increasingly irritating and embarrassing. Her father, she said, gave her everything she wanted and asked frequently if she was happy. And her mother disapproved of his lavishness, but was nevertheless herself lavish in praise of the daughter, and wanted to know everything that she did and thought. I mean, the mother was seemingly very intrusive indeed. She, for example, she frequently bought duplicate dresses for them, so that the mother and daughter could dress alike. And was overjoyed if the daughter would do something with her. And the only thing that pleased the mother more than that was if the daughter would date the right boys, which was determined in terms of their social and financial and educational background. Now, her older brother was abrupt and overbearing, and he had removed himself from the family some years before, and she felt very much deserted by him. In fact, he was seemingly aloof and uninterested in any of them, although they paid court to him. Before her adolescence, she remembered wanting to be very pretty and to meet the right man. Her mother repeatedly assured her, her mother repeatedly assured her that this would happen. That was a very accepted part of their interaction. But if she asked, her mother would tell her, yes, the right man would come along. And but so far he had not. He had not appeared. And she found, and instead she found herself very puzzled and annoyed by her boyfriends. Mostly she described them as sort of unpredictably sort of lunging at her, or else keeping away from her. So there was sort of no middle distance in her relationship with them. Now, one of the things that was striking about her was that she seemed to have very little sense that she was indeed now very pretty. In fact, that she's a real bombshell, and that these boys were both drawn to her and also put off by her, probably by this mixture of attractiveness, absent-minded hauteur that she had, and obedience. So it was a very discordant kind of picture she presented to people. I thought that she had sort of become the fairy princess that her mother had wanted her to be, but she didn't yet know it, in fact. Now, in the last year, as I mentioned, she'd increasingly experienced her mother as invasive and her father as futile. And neither of them, she said, would leave her alone. Her mother wanted to be too close, and her father was too pliable. She experienced him really as a sort of a limitless bank account. He had this interest in her happiness, and his way of ensuring that she would be happy would be to get her anything she wanted. And anything she wanted obviously being something that you could purchase. Now she had in terms of trying to define what was the matter with her, I think it's important to say that I think she had a very definite identity. She was this beautiful rich girl who could have anything she wanted and need only await Prince Charming. That was her identity, I thought. She nevertheless was not in possession of herself. That is, that these were both unacknowledged goals and they were unaccepted facts. She didn't feel beautiful. She was embarrassed at being rich some of the time and could only secretly dream of being both beautiful and richly loved. Now, with me, she displayed her identity as a rich and beautiful girl. At the same time, she hid herself away. It was like you were with a mannequin. Like you were with a mannequin. In that you sort of knew what the mannequin was dressed up to be, but that was not a human being. Now, a simple, direct approach to her might have been, what's the matter with being rich and beautiful? Why not come out and enjoy it? And we might then have analyzed any conflicts that she had about being rich and beautiful. And conflicts, perhaps, between these wishes and her superego or ego ideal or something. However, I didn't think that the conflict was between her wishes and any prohibiting agents. It turned out that she was really quite delighted to be rich and beautiful. I mean, as soon as she found out she was really delighted to be rich and beautiful. And there wasn't even a great deal of conflict between herself and her parents. She did not experience they want her to be rich and beautiful, and she didn't find that as interfering with her enjoyment of it. Everybody was pleased with this whole proposition, but from the patient was not aware. The point was, it was not in the patient's awareness as such. In other words, she didn't experience herself as beautiful, and she hardly seemed to experience herself at all. It might be true to say, although this is more subjective, that that she was a sort of mannequin to herself as well as to me. And I thought she was like many rich or beautiful people who have become their money or their looks. And there's no one to enjoy them, so to speak. They've sort of disappeared in their looks and their money, and there isn't anybody to sort of enjoy it. I don't know whether that constitutes whether one can construct a kind of metapsychological picture there. Why didn't she experience herself? Perhaps this too would be a function of conflict between parts of her mind. Yet, as I say, there was very little evidence of conflict, unless the inexperience of herself is evidence itself. I thought there was a quite seamless contentment with being rich and beautiful. No apparent or very little guilt within herself or within the family. This, the family felt, perhaps correctly, was what everybody wanted. Even the possibly charged theme of being more beautiful than her mother was talked about, at times even laughed about by them both. And it was laughed at hollowly by the patient who couldn't quite see that they would be talking about her. So that perhaps that was a conflict. Now, to try to describe a little bit how I tried to get at her. And one day she seemed especially still and absent. And I said rather musingly to her, "What is one supposed to do?" What is one supposed to do? That's an imitative statement. I thought it was an imitative statement. It was meant to be an imitative statement. She replied, considerably to my surprise, very crisply, which is unlike her, very crisply. She said, "Right," like that. And after a long pause, she said, "I don't know what to do. I never know what to do," in a kind of despairing sort of way. So I thought that perhaps I had put myself sort of in the midst of her uncertainty, spoken her uncertainty, and to some extent shared her desperation, which I had done by my tone of the way in which I had said, "What is one supposed to do?" I hadn't said that neutrally, in other words. At the same time, I did not imply that she should know or decide. I didn't imply that she should know or decide what to do, as many ways of calling attention to her indecision might imply. Now, that's very crucial to me, because there are lots of ways by which her indecision could have been brought into the clinical situation. But I don't think it's so easy to find a way to bring it in that doesn't carry with it, however subtly, the implication that she should decide. Which, of course, to someone who can't decide, is a criticism of a major sort, an invasive criticism again. And my argument here is that the imitative statement, "What do I want?" Just simply speaking what you think she's saying, is useful because it's not invasive and not critical that way. At the same time, shares her desperation and, of course, her uncertainty. And after I had said that, she described having a talk with one of the deans at her college, and she had pretended to the dean that she knew and liked the courses she was taking and that they meant something to her. But in fact, she hardly ever went to any of them. So that I thought that by telling me that, she was contrasting, she was leveling with me, in short, about that she had had to pretend that she knew what she was doing to the dean. And now she was saying, "I guess I don't need quite so much to pretend to you that I know what I'm doing." I thought that's what that was about. Now, at another time, this was actually close on to that. I then said, the only things I know I want are being beautiful and married. I said that. That was my remark. The only things I know I want are being beautiful and being married. And I said that with some enthusiasm. And then she again, very quickly, she said crisply, "Right," like that, and this kind of, and it was a part of her. It was a part of her that seemed to me very unfamiliar. Like it was sort of down to her. It was unmannequinish, in other words. It was very direct. It was forthright. "Right," she said, like that. And it was like a light going on. It was so unlike her usual contact. And then she seemed to relax. And then I added, "What else was I supposed to be?" I said this sort of, like, don't blame me. "What else was I supposed to be?" And then she said again very crisply, "Nothing," like that. And then I said, "Brother was very different." And then in a kind of rising, sarcastic tone with a great big smile, she pronounced, "Was he ever?" Like that. Which again was like a, from her, like a light going on. And I didn't want her to feel too sorry for herself in this typical woman's position. So I added a woman's lot, like a sort of offhanded way like that. And then there was another pause, and then she said in a kind of crescendo of surprise and revelation to us both, she said, "My mother never does anything." So I can't give you a sense of what most contact with her was like, and from accounts of what her life was like, what her life outside this was like, and how striking an appearance of her this was. An appearance of her. Herself, I'm arguing, came forward in this setting of these imitative remarks. Now, I remember I'm talking about people who have retreated from us into this artificial and mannequin existence. Now, here's another sequence here. Now, early in our relationship, was infatuated with a boy whose behavior at first puzzled and then greatly depressed her. He would approach her, say something friendly, then he'd rush away. And once or twice, he stayed long enough to sit down with her, and she became dizzy with excitement. She was just she almost fainted, she said. And then he disappeared for 2 weeks. And then she became depressed. So I assumed that she had been confused. She had been confused by his comings and goings. And she now felt depressed by what she took as his rejection. And so I guessed to myself, I didn't say this, but I guessed to myself that this was for her the prince that Mother had promised. And not the rather nervous, vain young man that I thought had been visiting her. Now I had to guess that that's what he was like, because she described nothing at all about him except these movements. And it sounded to me like he had a way of disappearing which was almost as complete as hers. But now I tried some simple empathic statements of the kind that I'll talk about in a little while, like exclamations, such as "It's awful to be left." I said that. And that didn't do much at all. And she'd tear up quickly. You could see her tear up. But then she'd become confused, and then she seemed to become more absent than ever. And I thought to myself, well, that won't work, because she's supposed to be happy. Her father is really terribly concerned that she be happy. And that if she is sad with me, that any paternal transferential elements, she'll have to turn that off and she'll become confused. So that I didn't think that we were ready by any means for her to be openly sad. So here's some of the things I said. I said, can he love me? And that seemed to catch her interest. And then I said, can I love him? And it just seems to be startled. And I thought she'd be startled by that, because if she was in love with him already, for someone to say, can I love him, is out to lunch. So she was startled, but then I quickly said, why is he so elusive? This is me talking. And then I added, aren't I beautiful? Emphasizing aren't. And that seemed to puzzle and then delight her, so she sort of lit up. Now, that these were all questions. All those are questions. I thought that was important because she was above all confused or questioning. So if I were to imitate her state of mind, I would have to be questioning too. And I closed with a statement, I just hope he's worth your while, in a somewhat perfunctory, slightly angry tone, which I was meant to put me squarely on her side and then also raise questions about him, since he left her. And whether coincidentally or not, she told me that she loved him, that she would have done anything for him. In fact, he more or less wiped his boots on her. And more important, she had not experienced his interest in her. she couldn't feel or see herself in this interaction. She hardly existed for herself in this interaction. Because that made it very hard to know whether he was really sort of nasty or ambivalent, or whether he also was puzzled by her absence as much as she was puzzled by his absence, comings and goings. And well, that was meant to be illustrative of things that appeared to reach her, and I went on very much in that style, and she seemed to develop more confidence, and later on that was startlingly illustrated by the fact that she tried some of the same thing on him. I mean, she would give him approach him, and then draw back from him before he drew back from her. And when she did that, which I had partly suggested to her, but when she did that, she then found to her great delight that he was down, he was flattened, as she had been. And he made some obvious moves that indicated that he was very, very fond of her. So she had really reversed the situation on him. And in that setting, she helped her to begin to realize what kind of an impact she had had on him. And still later, considerably later, she came to seem almost worldly wise, which was a startling change. It was a really great coming out, I thought. And my favorite example was, I had to laugh when she told me of uncovering a psychopath who was interested only in her looks and her money, and her father's money. And this was in her home in the Middle West, and whom she had left for good after a long, expensive dinner before the bill arrived, and he'd expected her to pay. So I thought that capacity to do that in that setting was what I would call real therapeutic gain, major gain. I mean, I'm quite serious, because I mean that shows self-possession. See? You're not afraid to get up. You know, you pick the right moment before the check comes, and you do it in such a way that you know, you've left your coat in the coat room, so you make sure that you get away with it. And he's left sitting there until the check comes. That shows great self-possession. And I'm contrasting that with this drifting, naive mannequin that had appeared originally on my doorstep. Well, and I don't mean to lay that all to imitative statements, but I think they really were a kind of entry point for this startlingly absent.
Were you able to stop after a while and get into a more traditional
more traditional. This last thing happened after we had worked in a much more direct fashion.
Yeah. Has it ever happened that you never get beyond these kinds of empathic, kind of imitative or whatever?
I don't. It can be months or years even, particularly with chronic catatonic people, where you'll only work with very simple empathic statements. So you finally find them. She wasn't doing exactly it. But I've never, where the work has gone on, I have never ended with that. You know. Now the other form of simple empathic speech I want to describe are what I call translations, and these are really more extensive form of exclamation. But I think they're extremely interesting in terms of the way they're constructed. A typical translation would be, "It feels awful," said to someone who feels awful, right? And to me, one of the things that's so interesting about that is its grammatical form. That is, it's a third-person, singular, impersonal statement. It feels awful. And this highly personal empathic work is being presented impersonally. That's a lot hangs on that. And by that I mean that the reason that's an empathic statement is that it is expressed impersonally. That is, it is to be contrasted with a statement where I might say, "You feel awful," which is not an empathic statement at all. It's an attributing statement. I attribute to you a state of mind. It doesn't share your state of mind. It's possible to say you feel awful in an empathic way that gets away with being empathic. But the statement itself is not empathic. because it is attributing. In other words, it says, I attribute to you a statement, rather than I share a state of mind with you. Okay? That seems to me fundamental, and I urge that on you because I know in my own working away at this psychotherapy, it took me a long time before I found out that making statements that attributed feeling states to other people was a mistake, and that it involved generally turning off the feelings or even arousing more anger.
It would shift it to more of an objective description.
Right, right. That would be a descriptive mode, wouldn't it, to describe the other person's state of mind. You must feel angry is, however, on the borderline, because by saying you must feel angry, it may mean that anyone would feel angry.
Right.
So there you can use a second person. But you can say it in such a way that it's still attributing. But it can be said empathically. So if it's not attributing, what word would you use for it? Well, the words I use are validating, normalizing, naturalizing the feeling, sharing the feeling, if you like, all those words. But it validates the feeling state. It says it's all right to be that way. Or I would feel that way, or anyone would feel that way. Normalize, universalize the feeling state. That seems to be the nature. So translations are, first of all, impersonal. Impersonal. Now, they're not merely impersonal, because if they were merely impersonal, they wouldn't be empathic, because they wouldn't convey a shared feeling. In order to convey the shared feeling, they have to have some kind of affective component. And it came as really to me, it was a great day when it occurred to me that the nature of empathic statements is that not only are they impersonal, they're also rhetorical. That means a great deal to me personally, because when I was a little boy, my father used to read me speeches from the House of Commons. He always wanted to be in the House of Commons in England, and he was born in Brooklyn, so it wasn't very likely he was going to be in the House of Commons. And he married an Englishwoman. I was as close as he could get. But he obviously would like me to be in the House of Commons, something of that kind. So his way of our going together to the House of Commons was to read me the speeches of Edmund Burke, the elder William Pitt, the younger William Pitt, all of these things, which I can still remember, long sections of it. And these are all rhetoric. And do you know what rhetoric is? I had to look it up in the dictionary when I thought that, my God, this is rhetoric. I knew it was rhetoric, but I didn't know what rhetoric was. And rhetoric is the art of expressive speech. And so that these remarks are also rhetorical, i.e. they express the emotion that's meant to be shared. Now, there are a lot of rhetorical devices that we don't necessarily use in empathic work, but there are a lot of rhetorical devices we do. Like, for example, questions, rhetorical questions. You know, a rhetorical question is when you already know the answer. You don't want the patient to answer it. You're not saying it to get information out. You're saying it to share something with them, a rhetorical question. And there's a place where a question is empathic sometimes. So anyway, so that to me that was almost startling, that empathic statements would be both impersonal and rhetorical. I have written a little defense of this in an effort to interest professional people in rhetoric. And because it's obviously not at all the way we're taught to speak. In fact, rhetoric is a device for orators, politicians, con artists, for all kinds of people that we would want to separate ourselves from very sharply indeed. And I thought to myself, well, now what would happen if I were to go down to the Analytic Institute and give a paper on rhetoric? What would they say? Well, I haven't done that yet, but I've done one or other things not too unlike it, and I think I know what would happen. I think they would say that, remember now, what Freud did was to call up from the vasty deep, you know, all the great forces of aggression and sexuality. And the reason why our interpretations and our interventions have to be rational, cool, is that we are dealing with these mighty forces from the vasty deep, right? That if we go off the deep end and begin to make rhetorical statements, won't we be, you know, out to be unable to manage these forces? And then I thought to myself, well, I know how to answer that one if they were to say that. Because in fact, that's exactly what rhetoric is for, is to control or master emotions. Of course, it can be used by Adolf Hitler and many other people in order to mobilize people's emotions and to control them and to manipulate them, all kinds of things of that kind. But maybe also it is by definition almost the device by which the emotional life of human beings is to some extent managed and touched, moved. What moves you? Interesting subject, what the word move means in that sentence. So I thought to myself, maybe we can have a place for rhetoric in clinical speech if we could convince ourselves that it was sometimes perhaps even the only device that would get us in contact with what we really believe are the nature of the forces with which we're contending. And then I thought to myself, I would also mention that when Freud first began to talk about sexuality to patients, I'm sure you know, there was hell to pay. How dare physicians discuss the intimate lives of their patients? I mean, it's pretty hard to talk about their viscera or something, right? Or their bleeding or their diarrhea. But you were not supposed to talk about their sexuality. Now you know that, I'm sure. And that this is one of the reasons why psychoanalysis had such an appalling reputation, and still does in some circles. You mean you would discuss something like that with a young woman? That kind of remark was endemic in the response to psychoanalysis. So one of my rebuttals now is, well, maybe someday people will think that that's just as ridiculous. Think that this disdain for rhetoric is just as ridiculous as we think that sort of attitude toward discussing sexuality. Well, I don't know how much headway I'm going to make, but that's the sort of argument I would like to make if I had ever got a chance. I wanted to read you a little bit of an exchange in which I try to show I've published this elsewhere, so it's maybe known to some of you, to show the way in which the impersonal and then at other times the rhetorical features of empathic statements are useful. This is an exchange that I had with there's actually three separate exchanges. I'll just give you a little portion of one or two of them. With a man who I saw for some time, a 35-year-old married man who was referred to me by his wife's therapist for help in becoming independent. It wasn't clear whose idea that was, and the couple were said to be very close and dependent on each other, which they were, through most of their 10-year marriage. But since her therapy, she had undertaken work of her own, and he, I was told, had reacted with concern. That's what came to me from the referring therapist. I found him a thin, affable man, very quick and bright and kind of sweet, but with a distinctly deferential air. To my surprise, he said he was as eager for the referral as his wife had been to provide it, because he said he had felt relieved by her growing independence and wanted to take steps of his own. It turned out he was really quite an independent man, and that she was the much more dependent one. Specifically, he had several artistic projects which he had postponed for years, and most important, he was thinking that he perhaps wanted to assume a homosexual lifestyle. Now, his family experience had been a very difficult one. The mother died when he was 5. His father then left the care of the household to the mother's sister, a wealthy, very wealthy, autocratic lady who hated the father and was quite seclusive and preoccupied. And the patient was largely taken care of by servants, who, however, were very friendly and helpful and often protective of the patient. And they were the principal companions he had until he was 16. However, when he was 12, the father remarried and attempted to recapture him from the aunt, the wealthy aunt. And she, however, resisted very stoutly. And the patient recalled not knowing where he wanted to go, and however, he found himself spending more and more time with his father. Nevertheless, the father remained very stiff and aloof. And at one point, the patient said to me, "I can't remember when he ever touched me." And the patient was said to resemble his mother, both in appearance and temperament. And he had always been a very lively, affectionate, helpful child. And his efforts to be affectionate with his father, however, seemed only to increase the old man's considerable reserve. Now, the part of the work that I want to present briefly concerned my attempt to uncover the patient's feelings for his father. Now, on one level, this represented no difficulties at all. He said he loved his father, he was aware of the father's coldness, he believed the father loved him in his extraordinarily reticent way. At the same time, he did not express any strong love or hate for the father. He was quite bland. Now, I decided not to allow these feelings to develop gradually in the transference. That was a self-conscious decision on my part, but instead to seek them out actively. Now, this is a point I wanted to make. One of the differences between associative and classical analytic work and empathic work is that in associative work, you wait for the material to come to you. In empathic work, you go to the material. Now, there are obviously advantages and disadvantages in both those. It's obvious that one is not better than the other. There are obvious striking advantages to waiting and striking advantages to sometimes going in search. Now, that'd be fun to argue about that, but anyway, that was my position. However, this justification covered an unasked for assumption of responsibility on my part. And he hadn't asked me to go for his feelings. He had really only enlisted me to help him seek his aesthetic and homosexual goals. And I became interested in whether an exploration of his deeper feelings toward both men and women might not affect his immediate decision. So in part, I was not minding my own business, and that is a real problem with a non-waiting stance. I'm not trying to defend it. I think that is a distinct disadvantage of such a method. We're already later than I wanted, but this is the first of three different exchanges, and they're meant to illustrate successive efforts to develop the patient's feelings for the father. Now, during the period of this first exchange, I could only imagine the patient's deeper feelings. My response to the patient were as bland as the latter were himself. In other words, when I tried to place myself close to him psychologically, I got nothing back from myself. And I didn't know what the hell was going on in terms of my own spontaneous response. And so I had to rely on what I call active empathy. And passive, this is a distinction I take probably from Carl Rogers, whose work is I think, basically passive empathy. You place yourself, you sort of approve, you wait with open arms for the person to come to you. And you let yourself register what you can. That's what I call passive empathy. While a man like Martin Buber describes what I would call an active empathic technique, where and I don't know if you've ever seen a picture of Martin Buber, but he looks like Martin Buber. I mean, he looks like Santa Claus, and a sort of active Santa Claus. And I can imagine him sort of bounding into the life of the other, which is an expression he himself uses, bounding into the life of the other. And I can see where it doesn't quite work. It would be, you have your hands full. But on the other hand, I don't know the man, but he might well be able to make that sort of active empathic leap. He's the one who's responsible for that line I'm forever quoting, about the goal of the work is imagining the real of the other. So you see there already the reaching into the other. So that's more activity, and that's what I was trying to do. However, I wanted to monitor as much as I could. I wanted to monitor the extent to which I was out to lunch with the patient, by the extent to which there developed in me feelings that I think might have come from the patient. See, that's a way by which your active empathic efforts might be disciplined by your falling back on a passive empathic stance periodically to see if indeed you were just shoving your own stuff on the patient, or whether indeed something was coming across from the patient. The patient said he never touched me. He would never even shake hands. And the patient said this very quietly and objectively. With more amusement. He had a sort of a slightly contemptuous, superior air about it. He never touched me. He would never even shake hands. And then I said, rather offhandedly, it hurt. I didn't say it. I didn't make a big thing of it. Very offhandedly, it hurt. Didn't bother me about it. So, indifferent. And the content of this message is affectful, but the medium or manner contradicted the message. And in there I was trying to be with the patient's blandness, to speak so objectively of his father's coldness. If I had been more expressive, it seems to me I would have provoked some kind of denial or argument. So see, I'm trying to establish myself with where he was, and one of the places he was his denial. So my empathic statement at first is really almost indifferent. Then the patient said, "My stepmother criticized me openly. It was always a fight. Now we just don't talk." This is the man that second wife the father married. Now, in this early phase of the work, mention of the stepmother or sister were regularly put in place of the expression of feelings toward the father. And in fact, historically, women had often come between him and his father. So I wondered if his mention of women when he was talking about his father was again sort of replacing them in between him and his father. His sister, for example, was very much between him and his father. The father would talk to the sister. The father was even effusive with his sister. And this is another thing that added to his sense of distance from the father, because he never had this experience, even though the sister could report it to him considerably. So he said, "My stepmother criticized me openly. It was always a fight. Now we just don't talk." And then I said, it was infuriating. Now, this was said with some intensity, but now we're talking, you see, about the stepmother, not the father. And I thought I could say that with some intensity, not only because he spoke with more intensity when he spoke with the stepmother, but also because women had fought for him and against the stepmother. And the women had been active people, emotional people in his life. It may have been one source of his homosexuality, that the women in his life had been much more real for him, much more open, much more affectful than any of the men that I found out about. At that point, he described several episodes in detail, each of which involved his frustration by his sister or his stepmother. And I was left wondering, where was his father? And I said then, the missing man, just like that. And all he said was, my aunt took over after my mother died. So I thought he was following. He was following the sequence of my thoughts, or rather, I was following the sequence of his thoughts. So when I said the missing man, he essentially explained where that the man was missing and who took his place. Now, I called this brief exchange establishing a sort of affective baseline. And of course, it wasn't as simple as that, but I made several attempts to find out what the sort of the baseline of his bland feelings was. And I thought then that there were two parts to this affective baseline. One was an amused, slightly hurt, bittersweet kind of resignation that he had about him. And the other was a rather quarrelsome, shrewish reaction, quick to occupy the ground of the first part if the resignation is disturbed. Now in this second part, I wanted to replace the bittersweet resignation with something more robust. I wanted to uncover or develop what I imagined the patient's real feelings to be. And I write uncover or develop because at this point I wasn't clear whether these were real feelings present or whether they were going to be uncovered or whether they would emerge as a fresh product of his interaction with me. Now note in the following exchange how objective elements, chiefly statements about states of mind, alternate and eventually mingle with expressive devices. And I thought the process sort of resembled climbing. Footholds or resting places, alternated with sort of bursts of activity until the two unite in this sort of excitement of arrival. I may be, glorifying what is quite commonplace by that. But I like to think of that sort of emotional dialectic. I said, how much you must feel about him, meaning the father. Now this represented a general sort of forward movement on my part, but it was still said very quietly. I made no effort to describe or express exactly what the patient felt beneath his resignation. I was left very general. How much you must feel about it. See, I don't identify any particular feeling state. It's meant to sort of move the whole thing forward. And then the patient said, I felt he loved me. He just couldn't express it. And now this time he stays with the subject of his father and the feelings, not replacing it with the women. And then I said, perhaps it was frightening to him. And this was very objectively said. In fact, it asked the patient to be objective about the father. See, it's a statement about the father rather than about the patient. It empathizes, in a sense, with the father. And then the patient says, it's true he didn't have any men friends. So he goes along with this description of the father. And then I said, in dismay, I said, oh God. And it wasn't really empathic because it sort of expressed my state of mind rather than the patient's. And I was about to take what I took to be a large empathic move, and I wanted the patient's attention. And really, this remark directs attention to me and my responses. And notice that in the result of this is that the patient asked me a question. In other words, the usual sequence of my questioning the patient, or anybody questioning the patient, is reversed. He asks me a question. He looks puzzled at me and says, what do you mean? So I caught his attention. And I said then, he couldn't give even friendship, and you must have wanted love. Now this was my large empathic movement. And then he said, starting to tear, which is the first time, with me at least, I had observed him tearing. He said, I wanted him to touch me. And from this, he's really lightweight kind of person, almost ephemerally lightweight person. This came as a very startling remark. I wanted him to touch me. And then I tried to deepen a little bit, at least. And I had in mind very much that he was conscious of wanting extensive physical contact with another man. So I said, at least. Actually, that occurred to me spontaneously. And then the patient said, I always wanted him to hold me. And this had about it almost a kind of desperate, almost creepy feeling. And then I said, to be loved and to love him too. And the first part I said, to be loved, was a little more matter of fact than the second, which had a sort of rising cadence, which was, and to love him too. Because I thought he was still less able to acknowledge his wish to be loved than of his loving. Well, I go on and along this kind of line, but those are meant to illustrate translational kinds of remarks, among other things. By the way, somebody put in my box, just noticed it, somebody put in my box, did you do that? Perfectly wonderful thing from, how do you say his name, Borges? Borges. I brought you something in the terms I thought you might like. I have these notes with me. One of which says, by the way, next Wednesday I'm not going to be here. I'm going to be in New York. And the following Wednesday, one of the medical students told me is a holiday. So you have to tell me whether you'll be here or not on that. That is a holiday, so we won't meet for then 3 weeks. Let me read you this thing. It's so wonderful. It's called Everything and Nothing. There was no one in him. Behind his face, parenthesis, even the poor paintings of the epoch show it to be unlike any other. And behind his words, which were copious, fantastic, and agitated, there was nothing but a bit of cold, a dream, not dreamed by anyone. At first he thought that everyone was like himself, but the dismay shown by a comrade to whom he mentioned this vacuity revealed his error to him and made him realize forever that an individual should not differ from the species. At one time it occurred to me that he might find a remedy for his difficulty in books. So he learned a small Latin and less Greek, of which a contemporary spoke. Later he considered he might find what he sought in carrying out one of the elemental rights of humanity, and so he let himself be initiated by Anne Hathaway in the long siesta hour of an afternoon in June. In his 20s, he went to London. Instinctively, he had already trained himself in the habit of pretending he was someone, so it should not be discovered that he was no one. In London, he found the profession to which he had been predestined, that of actor, someone who on stage plays at being someone else, before a concourse of people who pretend to take him for that other one. His histrionic work taught him a singular satisfaction, perhaps the first he had ever known. And yet, once the last line of verse had been acclaimed, and the last dead man dragged off the stage, he tasted the hateful taste of unreality. He would leave off being Ferrex or Tamburlaine and become no one again. Thus beset, he took to imagining other heroes and other tragic tales. And so, while his body complied with its bodily destiny in London, bawdy houses and taverns, the soul inhabiting that body was Caesar, unheeding the augur's warnings, and Juliet detesting the lark, and Macbeth talking on the heath with the witches, who were also the Fates. No one was ever so many men as that man. Like the Egyptian Proteus, he was able to exhaust all the appearances of being. From time to time he left in some obscure corner of his work a confession that he was sure would never be deciphered. Richard says that in his one person he plays many parts, and Iago curiously says, "I am not what I am." The fundamental oneness of existing, dreaming, and acting inspired in him several famous passages. He persisted in this directed hallucination for 20 years, but one morning he was overcome by a surfeit and horror of being all those kings who die by the sword, and all those unfortunate lovers who converge, diverge, and melodiously expire. That same day he settled on the sale of his theater. Before a week was out, he had gone back to his native village, where he recuperated the trees and the river of his boyhood without relating them at all to the trees and rivers illustrious with mythological allusion and Latin phrase which his muse had celebrated. He had to be someone. He became a retired impresario who has made his fortune and who was interested in making loans in lawsuits and in petty usury. It was in this character that he dictated the arid last will and testament we know, from which he deliberately excluded any note of pathos or trace of literature. Friends from London used to visit him in his retreat, and for them he would once more play the part of poet. History adds that before or after his death he found himself facing God and said, "I who have been so many men in vain want to be one man, myself alone." From out of a whirlwind the voice of God replied, "I am not either. I dreamed the world the way you dreamed your work, my Shakespeare. One of the forms of my dreams was you, who, like me, are many and no one." Isn't that marvelous? I love that. My Shakespeare. And you remember it was perhaps the closest that any man ever got to having his gifts. John Keats, who described his gift as the negative capability. Remember that phrase? The ability to surrender himself utterly, to be a negative, so that he could become those other people. And your good colleague penned down the bottom of this, this is called Everything and Nothing. And the title, he says, is from George Bernard Shaw, who, remember, who thought he himself Shakespeare's successor, said that repeatedly. And Shaw said, "I understand everyone and everything, and am no one and nothing." Where did he say that?
It's in the letter.
It's in the letter. Well, maybe we will reassemble that in 3 weeks, is it?